Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It is an honor once again to welcome back Haviv, who is a senior analyst for the Times of Israel, a journalist, political correspondent. He had been the director of communications at the Jewish Agency. He was the Jewish World correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. He has actually now been called into Miluim. He's also serving a role within the war itself, a little bit more not on the front lines, but a medical position as well. And it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So let me just jump right into it. We're in one of the most complicated times in modern Jewish history. And people are trying to figure out where to put their thoughts and their efforts, how they're able to really assimilate everything that's happening, because we thought we were at a peaceful juncture. We thought it was going to be quiet and peaceful, and now all of a sudden we find ourselves thrown into this war. How do you see, if you were putting forth your crystal ball, two things, the war itself and also how it's going to change world Jewry?
Well, the first part is easy. The second part is huge and complex. Where's the war going? Where's the war going is unfortunately easy to predict, because we know what the Israelis need and we know what Hamas needs. Hamas believes that it is in a forever war. It is in a war for the renewal and rejuvenation and restoration of Islam. It is a war that also has anti-colonial overtones. It's modeled on the Algerian independence war, this 8 years of terrorism that kicked the French out of Algeria in 1962 after 130 years. So it believes in this it speaks about the Crusaders, right? It took 200 years. The Crusaders were in the land and then eventually left. So it believes it's in this long, path forward, and that permanent war is how the Israelis will eventually give up and leave. That is the strategic theory, and it is a cold and thought out and carefully discussed theory by Hamas strategists and leaders in interviews in the last week, but also, in mosque sermons 20 years ago, right? It is never going to stop the war. So that, in that sense, the war continues. What do the Israelis need? The Israeli public, ordinary Israelis, who watched 1,400 people massacred, kidnapped, they need Hamas destroyed. Hamas, the great grand idea, the vision of Palestinian, the Palestinian cause as this anti-colonial permanent war. I don't know if you can destroy the idea. You can certainly make it fail, right? And then maybe Palestinians will reconsider their strategy. But Hamas, the organization, certainly can be destroyed. It's a few tens of thousands of people. We know who they are. If this specific military action in Gaza doesn't get them all, and probably won't get them all, they're doing literally nothing and have planned literally nothing for 15 years except how to survive this, we'll get them eventually. So the war will continue on the ground right now, uncomfortably, for certainly diaspora Jews for some time. There might be a few humanitarian pauses, but the war will continue. And then this back and forth sort of Israeli hunt for Hamas will continue for longer. The big question we're asking is, will it expand? Will it expand to the Lebanese frontier? Hezbollah, Iran has some other tentacles in the region, the Houthis of Yemen, some militias in Syria and Iraq. So that's where the war itself stands. And what will it do to world Jewry?
That's the tough part.
130 years ago, Theodore Herzel pulled a lot of different ideological and intellectual and religious strings and tied them all in a neat bow. There are many, many, many Zionisms. There are liberal Zionisms and more conservative Zionism, religious Zionisms, communist Zionisms. There are many versions of Zionism. And none of them are Zionism itself. What they all share is Zionism, is the heart, the essence. And what they all share is a warning. And it's Herzel's warning. He presented it most carefully. What Herzel argued was that in this new era of modernization, of modernity, of urbanization, of industrialization, when over the course of the 19th century, millions of Europeans left villages, left old identities, left a sense of place, and entered into this sort of what sociologists sometimes call mass societies. Suddenly you live for the first time in history in an apartment building. Suddenly you're an ant in the middle of this immense factory floor in the middle of Hamburg or whatever. This mass displacement that occurred to European society over the 19th century, which created communist theory, that Marx was responding to that displacement, but many, many other theories. Herzl warned that even though this was a period that felt to people at the time like a period of liberalization, parliaments were being established, were strengthening their power, science was solving problems, actually these new liberal mass societies have murderous impulses within them. The old identity of me, the German from some place in Bavaria, was a village identity or a provincial identity. But now suddenly I'm being told from the 1870s on that there's something called the German, and its Germanness is something that includes millions and millions of people I don't know. And these new mass identities, these new nationalisms, Herzl warned us, would be policed. In other words, they would not be able to contain minorities. There would always be this permanent tension. And, one of the great problems with minorities is that, I'll take Hitler as just the extreme example, but of this essential argument. Hitler's problem with the Jews was that the Jews, he said, were both German and also not German. They could be German in the morning, and then in the evening they could be something else. And that ability to go in and out of an identity called into question the organicness, the authenticity, the reality that the Nazis claimed for German identity. And so while, the Nazi racial hierarchy hated, other races, Asians, blacks, whatever, they had weird categories, but all those categories they hated, the Jews were the only category that was a threat to Germanness itself. And so they had to be exterminated. Herzl wasn't thinking of Nazism, but when he wrote in the 1890s, there was a catastrophe coming. He was essentially thinking of what was happening in the East. In World War I, and hundreds of thousands of Jews killed, millions of Jews fleeing because of these new national identities that could not contain minorities. And so, Zionism at its deepest core isn't a national movement. It's a kind of sociological analysis of modernity. And it's a sociological analysis of modernity that tells us that ultimately, because of human nature, because of the human psyche, because of this modern age of its mass identities, ultimately we're on our own. And the only way to avoid what Herzl called the coming catastrophe, and he talked about being murdered and being expelled, and he said, I don't know which one it will be, but it might be all at once, is to build our own separate society. Unfortunately, I think that everything we're seeing coming out of academia, everything we're seeing coming out of a lot of the sort of very left progressive sort of sections that want to justify Hamas without criticizing or thinking carefully about Hamas's ideas, the strange bedfellows of these anti-liberal, anti-modern Islamist jihadists alongside progressivist kinds of academic the identities are being policed again. And the Jews, again, need to ensure that they are safe, and that the potential of that coming catastrophe is something the Jews are now aware of. And so the future Jewish world, unfortunately, tragically, will be much more united and much stronger. And it will be made so by the insanity of the modern human. That was a strange answer.
No, it's something I saw. I was in Israel last week, and I was at Kibbutz Zikim. And I spoke to the Maskir Pnim. There was a group of us speaking to the Maskir Pnim, the person in charge of the kibbutz. He was also in charge of the factory. And we asked him, what will it take to get the 900 people who are not living in Zikim back to Zikim today? They're at a skeletal staff. And Zikim is a Shomer Hatzir kibbutz, far left wing. His answer was very simple. It needs security. I said, well, what's the security? He said, when I'll be able to see from where I'm sitting here all the way to the Mediterranean without anything in the way, which meant to destroy Hamas and Gaza as it is today. And to hear that from someone from the far left brings you to a reality that people are seeing, that there is this, not just what happened on October 7th, but a realization that a lot of the positions that we had taken of that we can be among everyone else and that everything can work out and we can feel safe has been destroyed. It's a fascinating and frightful reality that we're seeing. I think more in the progressive world, in the progressive Jewish world, than we see in the traditional Jewish world, which was more to the right. Is that playing? Do you see that playing out in Israel across the board? Are people moving away from positions that they'd once thought of living in peace?
You know, one of the most interesting figures right now in Israeli politics is the head of the Ram party, the Arab Islamist party in the Knesset, I mean, Mansour Abbas, who for 20 years has been advocating, even though he has this very religious and conservative worldview, in an odd way, sometimes the conservative religious view is the more moderate view, because he doesn't need to bring about redemption today. He believes in a just God and a just arc to history, and so he can push off redemption to the future. In the future, of course, all people will be Muslims, including these nice Israelis, and we're all going to be together in a Muslim utopia. But I don't have to do that now. That's why there's a God, and God will take care of that. And right now, I can seek out a better future for my people in this Jewish state. And so he has tried to really push integration, understanding, coexistence. And he saw the filming in the Knesset of the unedited body cam footage that was screened for members of Knesset of the massacre and of the murders and of the horrors in that, again, was, you know, I haven't seen it. I refuse to see it. When it pops up on some video, on some social media feed, I scroll past it without looking. I actually think halachically we're forbidden from seeing it, because it is these people's dehumanization, and we don't have a right to see it. It also hurts our souls. What you take in, Judaism tells us, affects your soul. So don't take in things that will hurt your soul. If I needed to be convinced that it really happened for the Jewish people to protect itself, show it to me. But I don't need to be convinced of that, so I don't have a right to see it. Mansour Abbas saw this video, and he went on an Arabic language radio station in Israel, and he gave this interview. And he said, what I saw there wasn't Islam, and it wasn't us, and it wasn't our people, and it wasn't anything that we would recognize or anything that we believe in. And it wasn't just a distancing, it was an accusation that Hamas is neither Islam, nor Palestine, nor any identity that he identifies with in any way. One of the really fascinating things, you mentioned the Israeli left that watched this massacre and said, this isn't a terrorist responding to an occupation. This is genocidal in aesthetic, in intent, certainly. But they really genuinely want to kill every man, woman, and child. But that same process that says, whoa, wait, Palestinian politics are suffused with this thing that I cannot live with. I don't know how to live with it. It literally wants me dead. That's happening among Israeli Arabs in numbers that would shock you, numbers that are shocking me. We're seeing huge numbers of Israeli Arabs say that their main identity now, huge numbers, their main identity is Israelis. They feel themselves to be Arab and Palestinian and Muslim and all of these many layers of their identities. Israeli is becoming more important to them, not less. And we haven't seen any kind of joining in any of these sort of Hamas, protests or anything like that since October 7th. And so the sheer inhumanity of it, the sheer horrors of the atrocities have driven a profound shift on the left. Gaza is not going away. We're going to have to find some path forward there. But the horror and the anger and the sense that the whole world has collapsed, certainly my ideological world among these Shomer Tza'ir kibbutznikim, I understand that. I sympathize with that. But it's even happening in the Israeli Arab community.
And one of the things I saw was that the government almost is a non-entity in a lot of the pieces of this war. The army is, and the volunteerism has risen to a level of beyond extraordinary that what people are doing. I visited one of the hotels where the people of Sderot were living, and what they set up there, from nurseries to entertainment to the school that they created and everything else, all from a volunteer basis. The government seems to have moved almost into the background on this in terms of the day-to-day life of the Israelis. How is that going to work with the government after this war?
I try very hard not to be explicitly political or partisan, certainly, because I write about politics and I write about things that I would like right wingers and left wingers to be able to read what I write. But what we have seen just in real time from this government, there are points of light. There are especially ministers from Shas who have been competent and really caring and met with the families of the hostages and met with the victims' families of the dead, and really tried very hard to move a lot of money around to where it's desperately needed right now. And there have been big debates about coalition funds, that these various parties had their pet projects or their communities, and a lot of those funds have to be diverted to the war effort, which is extremely expensive. Expensive both because the actual war is expensive, but also because well over 100,000 Israelis have been pulled back from the northern border, from their towns, from their homes, and they're being held in essentially hotels because of the expectation of a northern war. And so a lot of politicians have really made an effort to be part of the program, to be part of the effort, but a lot have not. And by a lot have not, I unfortunately mean Benjamin Netanyahu. He has not yet met, it's November 8th, a month and a day. He has not yet met the mayors of the areas affected, not because they haven't asked. He has press conferences. He has yet to allow a question to be asked at a press conference since the beginning of the war. No questions are allowed by journalists. Benny Gantz, who is in the war cabinet, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu all gave briefings today on the Israeli press. The Prime Minister's office refused to have them give the briefing together. There's a sense that there's still politics happening by our political class. And it's not at all just Netanyahu. It's many, but there is a lot of anger, and it's anger you're hearing on the right as much as on the left, of a political class that, for too long, our politics have kind of devolved into a lot of polarization and a lot of bitterness and a lot of pettiness. And at this moment, just as you said, every Israeli is contributing. Every Israeli is helping. Family members are staying with me. We're taking care of each other. My neighbors are helping me. I'm helping them. Every Israeli everywhere in the country. Every hotel chain is hosting families for free. First, they host the families, then they go to the government and ask for money, but they're not going to wait with these families with no homes before allowing them into empty hotels now that the tourists are gone. Everyone, companies, individuals, they're all doing it. 360,000 people have been called up. And there's a sense that our government isn't there, that there's something that really deep that needs to be fixed in our government right now.
Does Israel have the Israeli public have the wherewithal to come to continue to be together and to make those changes? Or do we think that once the war is over, this extraordinary unity that exists will begin to peel off and go back to the partisan politics?
That's such a good question. Obviously, I desperately hope the unity remains, right? We're going to fight each other, whatever, but we're going to basically understand that we're together. This was a country that a month ago felt like it was tearing itself apart. I suspect that the shock of October 7th is historic. I suspect it'll last a very long time. I suspect that we will go back to the disagreements. We have authentic, honest, real, important disagreements about our constitutional system, about religion and state, about all these things. They're not going to go anywhere. They shouldn't go anywhere. But people were calling each other traitors consistently. Major, political voices were calling half the country traitors. By the way, not from one side. I don't think that language is coming back so quickly. I think the people who engaged in that kind of politics, in that kind of polarization, sort of intentional manipulative polarization politics, I think that a lot of Israelis think that that's a big part of are weakening and are the weakening of our sense of resolve. And certainly our enemies have said so, right? The supreme leader of Iran, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, the heads of Hamas, they've all given speeches over the last 3 months about how Israel is falling apart. Now's the time to strike. Or, wait a minute, it's about to collapse, right? That sense of our weakness was partly contributed by that polarization. I think they will be punished by the Israeli public. And I hope that we move forward into a different kind of politics. I'm optimistic in that regard. I hope justifiably.
The pressure that's starting to come from the United States for the pauses, the humanitarian pauses, and Prime Minister Netanyahu says he'll take an hour pause, and Blinken wants to have 2-3 days of pauses. How is the Israeli public responding to the idea of a pause?
I think there's a lot of resistance. There's a desperation to get out the families, to get out the hostages, right? We all know hostages. We all know personally. We've been close working. My wife and I volunteered with friends who have whose 8 family members are in Gaza, including a 4-year-old girl, the Haran family from Kibbutz Be'eri, and every Israeli knows someone who knows someone at the very least, right? And so there's a desperation to get those hostages out. At the same time, the only reason Hamas is now offering 12 or 15 hostages, the reports are contradictory, a little bit different reports from Qatar and Egypt. Hamas is offering, in exchange for some kind of a pause, some hostages, and to make it hard for Israel to say no, half of them are Americans. But the only reason it's offering that is because Gaza City is surrounded. The Israeli army has sealed 130 entrances to the tunnels. Hamas essentially got to build this battlefield, and Israel's responding to that fact, to that dangerous battlefield that it is entering, by building it in return. In other words, trying to reshape that battlefield in return by essentially sealing an ever-tightening circle around the bunkers and headquarters of Hamas within Gaza City, or I should say under Gaza City. And in its desperation, Hamas has proven that it has not yet, maybe it changes, but it has not yet been able to launch any meaningful attacks on the Israelis. And I think that this is a bid to win 2 or 3 days in which they can look for weak places in the Israeli line, in which they can recuperate, move, material around, move supplies around, and in which they can pump out more easily images of Gaza's civilian suffering, which is real and is powerful, but of course for Hamas is mainly useful for propaganda purposes. It hides under these civilians and sees their deaths as a force multiplier on the battlefield. But Hamas does want that. Now, why would Israel give them that? Strategically, the goal is to destroy Hamas. I have a hard time imagining Israel agreeing to more than that hour, 2-3 hours. I have a hard time agreeing that with the success of this operation, Israel would now slow it down, stop it, give Hamas a chance to reverse it.
And looking at the media, how are we doing? How is Israel doing in the world media?
Terribly. On social media, we're losing the fight completely. If you go to TikTok, I saw numbers for California. I believe half of Californians under the age of 30, their main source of news is TikTok. And on TikTok, the Palestinian supporting posts are getting, it was 3 billion to 200 million. So what is that, 15-fold? 15 times the views as Israel supporting posts. And that's affecting how young Americans on the West Coast, and again, we have to check the data again, but it might be larger than just that part of America. It might be all of America. But those are the kinds of numbers we're seeing everywhere. On Twitter, which is a bit of an older crowd, that's my crowd. Facebook, an older crowd still. In all of these places, there are these massive campaigns, organized, funded. In some cases, the algorithm is changed for them. China is a partisan in this, and China controls TikTok. Israel's losing that war for the consciousness of the world, partly, by the way, because of our leadership. I mean, in a war where the president of the United States is fending off massive left-wing criticism that he's going to need on election day in a year in order to hold the window open because he genuinely wants Israel to smash Hamas, an Israeli minister allowing himself to say that we should drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, it makes it harder for the American administration to make that argument to its own political world. And that means that the day will come sooner when the American administration says, guys, I'm not going to lose an election for you. Please start shutting down this operation. The day we get that message from the Americans, if the Israelis don't outright defy it, which will have a cost, we'll lose those aircraft carriers, keeping Iran at bay, potentially keeping Hezbollah at bay. The day that message comes, the Israelis might tell those soldiers on the ground, whatever you don't get in 3 days, you're not going to get. So move faster. We'll move faster through booby-trapped tunnels, move faster through a densely populated city. It means more civilian dead. It means more of our soldiers dead. And it means less Hamas fighters dead. And so the irresponsibility of a comment like that is shocking, but but that has been, and it's not one. I'm referring to Amichai Eliyahu, the minister of tradition, I believe is his title. But there has been this sort of irresponsible rhetoric coming from the Israelis. We're losing that war. We are losing it partly because we're not good at it. We don't understand it as Israelis. We have a kind of disdain for explaining ourselves to the world because it feels like justifying. And the heart of Zionism is that we no longer justify ourselves to other people. And so there's a cultural problem, and we have to buck those headwinds. There's not much I think we're going to do to fix it at this point.
What would you advise? I'm sitting in Chicago. What would you advise to the Jews in Chicago or anywhere else in the United States that they can do that would be the most profound support for Israel at this time?
I think that it's important to speak up. I think that liberal Jews in America are discovering very unpleasant things. That some groups that they thought were their allies, that they really genuinely, profoundly believed in and in their causes. Black Lives Matter's largest chapter, the Chicago chapter, thrilling at the sight of the mass murderers landing on the festival by publishing the paraglider as a photo, right? That is something that I know shocked liberal Jews who put Black Lives Matter flags and posters on their yard in places like Manhattan. I guess not Manhattan, Brooklyn, you have yards, right?
Yeah.
A lot of Jews are in shock. A lot of Jews don't understand what all of this means. What does it mean that there's these literally anti-Semitic chants in Sydney, Australia, hundreds of people shouting, "Gas the Jews," and a man beaten until he's wounded and hospitalized, a Jewish man in a park in Sydney yesterday, I think it was. There are hundreds of Sydney residents who think about gassing the Jews, and the Jews of Sydney know it. That has a cowing effect. That has a silencing effect. That creates fear. After the 20th century, Jews no longer have the right to live in fear. Jews no longer live in fear. Stand up, speak up. You come at it from a left-wing perspective. You want a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. You want to push for it. You want to criticize Israel. Fantastic, go for it. Half of Israelis agree with that. But first we get rid of Hamas, and then it becomes possible. You want to come at it from a right-wing perspective, advocate for your position, do it, come at it. But stand up, speak up, talk about how we have to get rid of Hamas. There's no Palestinian future as long as Hamas is there. Be proud of that, know it, be strong about it. You'll be screamed down. We are a small people. Even in the two places where we're a lot, America and Israel, we're still very small. So I guess just speak up, be heard, don't be ashamed, be proud, be on social media, stand up. You're going to get screamed down by some violent, brutal, bullies, essentially. It doesn't matter. You're a Jew. You don't cow anymore to anyone else.
Which is the reason that next week, the rally in Washington, D.C. is so very important. It's the time of funding. It's the time where the Jews have to come forward. Everyone is trying to get there to make it happen. And I hope that rally of people that were listening, I hope they're making arrangements to be there on next Tuesday on the 14th, and that they're planning on being from 1 to 3 on the National Mall and showing the strength of the Jewish people, which is what it's all about. Haviv, our time is up. I want to thank you so very much for your thoughts, for your insight. And please, God, you and your family and your loved ones will all stay safe through this. And the next time we have a chance to speak, we'll be talking about happy things that are going on in Israel today, not just the Achdut, which is wonderful, the unity that is wonderful, but maybe the things we'll be able to build after this war is concluded. Thank you so very
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.